The Mac startup sound. Perhaps one of the most recognizable sonic logos, or SOGOs, ever created, alongside Netflix, Intel, and this one. The Mac startup sound is meant to represent cleansing, new beginnings, and endless possibilities. But did you know that the Mac startup sound used to sound like this? Ew. If you had the same reaction to the sound that I did, then you'll be glad to know that there are psychological and musical reasons for it, which I'll explain later. But first, let me tell you the story of how Apple went from that horrible sound to the one that we all know and love. The story starts with Jim Reekes, a programmer and musician who joined Apple in 1988 and worked on various audio projects including the QuickTime framework. Reekes actually started out doing tech support, but within a couple of years, due to his niche skill set combining both audio and computers, he was put in charge of all things audio at the company. Apple was gearing up for the release of their Quadra family of computers, a new high-end line with speakers that actually face forward instead of facing the top of the desk, according to Reekes. So naturally, he wanted a sound that could show off the new machine's capabilities. Also, remember that the sound at the time was this.
Okay, so I gotta get rid of that.
Many people, including Reekes himself, claim this sound consists of an infamous interval called the tritone.
If you're a musician, you know about an interval called the tritone. If you're a religious person, it's actually called the interval of the devil.
However, listening carefully, I don't think that the sound uses tritone intervals, and instead the intervals between the notes are a fourth and a fifth. Decide for yourself. Here's what the tritones sound like. And here's what a fourth and a fifth sound like. And here's the old startup sound for reference. Ironically, Apple introduced the sound in the mid-90s as a crash chime, which uses a tritone interval. And according to Reekes, he was still in charge of all sounds at Apple then.
So anyway, the Mac was built upon these intervals.
Reekes recalls that the Macs would crash very often in those days, and he was fed up of hearing that horrible sound when he was already frustrated at the computer having crashed. So instead, he wanted a sound that could give off a sense of calm and act as a reset for both the computer and his emotions. However, management were unhappy, complaining that it would be a huge task to change the sound, so Reekes had to rely on his rebellious ways instead. Some of the data required to start up your computer is stored on what's called ROM, which stands for read-only memory. And Reekes knew the person who was in charge of the ROM for the new Mac, so he got them to sneak the new sound on. In the next few years, Apple tried a couple of other sounds, but when Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he decided that the original Reekes sound was going to be the Apple sound from that point on. The sound that Reekes created was this. Now, chances are, unless you were alive in the 80s, that probably sounded a little off to you, and you remember something more like this one. We'll look at the differences between the two in a bit, but let's first talk a little bit more about the original sound itself. The concept of the sound was inspired by the final chord in the song Day in the Life by the Beatles. It's primarily made up of a big C major chord played on a Korg Wavestation EX synthesizer, with many sounds stacked on top of each other to give it a full, thick sound. And it also contains a pan flute at the start of the sound to give it a little attack. Sounds simple, right? But let's start to dissect the sound bit by bit and also dip our toes into some human psychology to try to understand why this has become such an iconic sound. First, let's talk about the tonality. Major chords are generally regarded as being happy and positive, as well as one of the most stable chords in music, which means they can provide a sense of resolution and finality. By contrast, the tritone that we talked about earlier and chords featuring it are said to be unstable, and the ear wants to hear something after it to resolve the tension. For example, see how you feel up until the point where the dissonant chord is resolved. C major specifically also has quite a special place in our culture because the C major scale is the only major scale that can be played using only the white keys on a piano or keyboard. So, piano teachers, whether in person or on YouTube, often demonstrate a lot of concepts using the C major scale. And given how much familiarity affects our positive sentiment towards something, this subconscious exposure to the C major sound may have helped the startup sound get a good rep in the early days. Next, we come to the topic of timbre, which is super important in human perception of sound in general. Timbre can be thought of as the color of a sound, and it's what differentiates a guitar from a piano or a trombone, for instance, even if they're playing the exact same notes. A single note played on an instrument is actually made up of a whole range of frequencies at different volumes. The differences in timbre between two sounds, therefore, comes from the differences between all those frequencies that make up the sound, as well as how they change over time. Timbre, just like tonality, can have a big impact on our emotions, and studies have shown that certain instruments like trumpets or synths evoke feelings of happiness and positivity, whereas instruments like solo violin or guitar evoke sadness. John Williams' epic Imperial March from Star Wars would have a very different feeling had it been played with the flutes and bassoons used in Chinese dance from Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. It's also been found that timbre, alongside pitch, are the two most important qualities of a sound when it comes to brand recognition. And since the Apple startup sound doesn't have a distinct melody like the Intel sound, for instance, timbre plays a huge role in its effectiveness. As we said earlier, the sound starts off with a chiff from a pan flute. The pan flute is generally associated with folk or even spiritual music, and Europeans might also be familiar with people in Native American costumes playing the pan flute in town centers. It therefore gives the sound a quite natural vibe, perfectly in tune with the intended goal of the sound having a cleansing effect. The sharp attack also gives it that burst of energy, signaling to the user to wake up and that the computer is almost ready to go. Interestingly, the later versions of the startup sound have this cut off, so all you can hear is a small click. The timbre of the rest of the sound is quite pure, or in other words, doesn't have a lot of the upper harmonics that might give it a harsh and grating sound, like this synth, for example. If we look at the frequency spectrums of the two sounds, we can see that the synth has a lot of the higher frequencies present that contribute to the richer but harsher sound, which may not fit the relaxing vibe that Reekes was going for. This bassy, warm timbre of the sound subtly hints at the user that everything will be okay and that they're doing just fine. Also, remember at the beginning how I said Reekes' original sound probably sounded off to 90s kids? Well, that's because the later version was changed from a C major chord to one closer to a lower F sharp. One theory suggests it's to do with the differences in playback rate in later computers, though it was pitched down again to an F major in 2020 when Apple brought the sound back, having got rid of it for a few years. So it could simply be that they think it sounds more powerful and sincere with this even bassier timbre, and they also want to show off their speakers, no doubt. The decision to keep the sound, I think, is not only because of its originally intended relaxing vibe, it's also to do with how well it complements the image that Apple as a brand wants to convey in general. They're well known for their slick, minimal, and high-quality products, and this warm and powerful but simple startup sound conveys this much more accurately than something like McDonald's playful melody. Functionally, it's also super important for marketing. Apple doesn't have a consistent sonic logo for its TV ads, for example, but the startup sound can be heard all around you in coffee shops, lecture halls, or your friend's house. The more familiar you are with something, the higher the chances that you'll like it, in what's called the mere exposure effect. So this works out as free marketing for Apple by its users, with the added bonus that sounds can be heard passively in the background, as opposed to visual logos on clothes or billboards, for example, which obviously need the person to look directly at them. Of course, most people are already familiar with Apple these days, but in the early days of personal computing, when they were only in a few homes, the sound would have been a huge part of the special Macintosh experience. The Apple startup sound is one of the earliest examples of a sonic brand identity for a consumer product, something that's become ubiquitous today, and this has been going strong for 30 plus years now. It was featured in the film Wall-E, was patented by Apple in 2012, and has even inspired countless musical tracks. It's a glimpse into how sound design can be used to affect human emotions, and its power to convey abstract concepts in psychology, branding, and marketing. If you can think of other reasons why this startup sound is so effective that we may have missed, or you can think of other sonic logos that are even better at playing with our emotions, then leave a comment down below. But for now, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Mixed Signals. Bye bye.